For 23 years, the state of Georgia held its breath for a little girl who never came home. Her name was Melissa Reese, and on a spring afternoon in 1989, she vanished without a trace from the streets of Valdosta. What followed was one of the most exhaustive search efforts in the state's history, a case that would haunt investigators and break a family's heart for more than 2 decades. But here's what makes this story absolutely extraordinary. Melissa Reese was alive the entire time. She was breathing, growing, building a life under a completely different identity, with no memory whatsoever of the family that never stopped searching for her. This is the story of how a cold case that seemed destined to remain unsolved forever was cracked wide open by a combination of fate, cutting-edge technology, and investigators who refused to give up. This is the story of Melissa Reese. Before we dive into this incredible case, if you love true crime stories that need to be heard, do me a favor and hit that like button right now. Drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from because I genuinely want to know. And make sure you smash that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another story like this one. Your support means everything and helps us bring more forgotten cases to light. The spring of 1989 arrived in Valdosta, Georgia, with the kind of warmth that made children restless to play outside and parents grateful for the longer daylight hours. It was a different time back then, a time before cell phones were in everyone's pocket, before GPS tracking could locate a missing person in minutes, before Amber Alerts could broadcast a child's disappearance across an entire state within hours. For the internet connected us all and made the world feel both impossibly large and strangely small at the same time. In small southern towns like Valdosta, life moved at a gentler pace. It was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other by their first names and could tell you stories about each other's grandparents. Children played outside until the streetlights flickered on, signaling it was time to head home. Front doors were left unlocked during the day. Screen doors banged shut as kids ran in and out. And the greatest danger parents worried about was their children scraping their knees on the pavement or coming home a few minutes late for dinner. It was a community where everyone looked out for everyone else's children, where a sense of belonging wasn't just a nostalgic ideal people talked about, but a living, breathing reality woven into the fabric of everyday life. Melissa Reese was 8 years old that spring. She was a bright-eyed second grader with blonde hair that her mother usually pulled back into pigtails that bounced when she ran. She had a gap-toothed smile that could light up an entire room and a laugh that was infectious to everyone around her. She was the younger of 2 children born to David and Sarah Reese, a hard-working, working-class couple who had built their modest life in Valdosta with limited financial means, but an abundance of love for their children. David worked 6 days a week at the local hardware store on Patterson Street. It was demanding work that kept him on his feet most of the day, but it allowed him to be home for dinner with his family most nights, which mattered more to him than anything else. Sarah worked part-time as a receptionist at a dental office downtown, a position that gave her the flexibility she needed to be available for school pickups, after-school activities, and all the little moments that make up a childhood. Their older son, Marcus, was 11 years old and had recently fallen head over heels in love with baseball. He spent nearly every free moment at the local diamond, practicing his swing, working on his pitch, dreaming of one day playing in the major leagues. The Reese family lived in a small ranch-style house on Magnolia Street, tucked into a quiet residential neighborhood where children rode their bikes up and down the cracked sidewalks and families gathered in backyards for barbecues on warm summer weekends. Their home was modest by any standard, but it was impeccably well kept. There was a small front yard where Sarah planted azaleas every spring, their bright pink blooms a source of pride for her. The backyard featured a swing set that David had spent an entire weekend assembling the previous Christmas, determined to surprise the kids on Christmas morning. Inside the house, the walls told the story of their lives together. Family photos in mismatched frames lined the hallway. Crayon drawings from both children were held up by magnets on the refrigerator door, a constantly rotating gallery of their creativity. A collection of delicate ceramic figurines that Sarah had inherited from her grandmother sat carefully arranged on a shelf in the living room, each piece holding a memory of the woman who had raised her. Melissa was the kind of child that teachers absolutely adored. Her second-grade teacher, a woman named Mrs. Patterson, who had been teaching for nearly 20 years, would later tell investigators that Melissa was one of the most eager-to-please students she had ever encountered. She was always raising her hand to answer questions, even when she wasn't entirely sure of the answer. She was always the first to volunteer to help pass out papers or clean the chalkboard after a lesson. She took pride in being helpful, in being good, in making the adults in her life proud of her. At recess, Melissa had a small but close-knit circle of friends. Girls she would sit with at lunch, sharing snacks and secrets. Girls she would play with during recess, their favorite game being an elaborate pretend scenario where they ran a restaurant together. Melissa always insisted on being the head chef and waitress. She would take orders from her friends with great seriousness, then serve them imaginary meals creatively constructed from sand, leaves, and whatever else they could find on the playground. She loved to draw. She would sit for hours at the kitchen table, filling page after page with pictures. She drew her family over and over again. She drew their dog, a scruffy terrier mix named Rusty. She drew elaborate, fantastical scenes of princesses living in towering castles, dragons guarding treasure, magical forests that existed only in the boundless landscape of her 8-year-old imagination. At home, Melissa was endlessly chatty and deeply affectionate. She had a habit of following her mother from room to room, asking question after question about everything that crossed her mind. Why was the sky blue? Where did babies come from? Why did birds fly south for the winter? How did the television work? Sarah would answer each question as patiently as she could, marveling at her daughter's curiosity, her need to understand the world around her. Melissa adored her older brother Marcus, despite the typical sibling squabbles that would erupt between them. They fought over which television show to watch, who got to sit in the front seat of the car, whose turn it was to feed Rusty. But beneath the bickering was a genuine affection. Marcus was protective of his little sister in the way that older brothers often are, and Melissa looked up to him with the kind of hero worship that only a younger sibling can muster. In the evenings, after dinner had been cleared away and the dishes washed and put away, the family would often gather together in the small living room. They would watch sitcoms or game shows on their television set, the four of them squeezed onto the couch together. Melissa would curl up next to her mother, already changed into her pajamas, fighting with everything she had to stay awake until her official bedtime, not wanting to miss a single moment of family time. The Reese family was not wealthy by any measure. They lived paycheck to paycheck like so many American families did. But they were happy, genuinely, authentically happy. They took modest vacations to nearby beaches, packing sandwiches for the drive to save money. They celebrated birthdays with homemade cakes that Sarah would bake from scratch, decorated with too much frosting and mismatched candles. They attended the local Methodist church most Sundays, sitting in the same pew week after week. David volunteered as an assistant coach for Marcus's Little League team. Sarah volunteered one day a week at the elementary school library, reading stories to classes of squirming children. They were the kind of family that embodied the American dream in its most authentic, unpretentious form. They worked hard at their jobs. They loved each other deeply and without reservation. And they believed with absolute certainty that as long as they had each other, they had everything they truly needed in this world. April 26, 1989, started like any other Thursday. It was an ordinary day that would become the dividing line in the Reese family's life. The day that would split their existence into a before and an after that could never be reconciled. Sarah woke the children at 6:30 in the morning, just like she did every school day. She made breakfast while they got dressed, the familiar sounds of the morning routine filling the small house. David had already left for work earlier, his lunch packed in a brown paper bag, his thermos filled with the strong black coffee he preferred. The morning routine had become so familiar over the years that it had taken on an almost ritualistic quality. Sarah would drive the kids to school in the family's aging station wagon, a vehicle that was showing its age but still ran reliably. She would park in the designated drop-off lane. She would kiss both children goodbye. She would watch them walk through the school's front doors. Only then would she drive away, heading to her own job. That particular morning, Melissa had been especially chatty during the drive. She was excited about an art project her class was starting that day. She told her mother in great detail about how they were going to make collages using cutouts from old magazines. She had already decided with the certainty that only an 8-year-old possesses that she was going to make hers entirely about animals, dogs and cats and horses and every creature she loved. Sarah smiled at her daughter's enthusiasm, reached over to straighten the collar of her shirt, and kissed her forehead one last time before she got out of the car. "Have a great day, sweetheart," she said, the same words she said every morning. "I will, Mommy," Melissa replied, flashing that gap-toothed grin that Sarah loves so much. Then Melissa turned and skipped toward the school entrance, her backpack bouncing against her small frame with each step. It would be the last time Sarah Reese would see her daughter for 23 years. The last time she would hear that voice. The last time she would see that smile. The last normal moment before everything changed forever. The school day proceeded normally. Melissa attended her classes. She participated in the art project she had been so excited about, carefully cutting pictures of animals from magazines and gluing them onto construction paper. She ate lunch with her friends. She played at recess. Her teacher noticed nothing unusual about her behavior or mood. To everyone around her, it was just another ordinary Thursday in the life of an ordinary 8-year-old girl. But Melissa Reese never made it home that afternoon. When the final bell rang at 3 o'clock, children poured out of Valdosta Elementary School like they did every day. Some climbed onto yellow school buses. Some were picked up by parents waiting in the carpool line. Others, including Melissa, were walkers who lived close enough to make the journey home on foot. Melissa typically walked home with 2 other girls from her neighborhood. They would walk together, chattering about their day, until they reached the point where their paths diverged and each girl headed to her own house. But on April 26, Melissa never arrived at the usual meeting spot where the girls gathered. Her 2 friends waited for a few minutes, then assumed she must have been kept after class or had gone home with her mother for some reason. They thought nothing of it and walked home without her. It wasn't until Sarah arrived home from work at 3:45 and found the house empty that the first tendrils of worry began to creep in. Sarah called out for Melissa as she walked through the house, expecting to hear her daughter's voice responding from her bedroom or the backyard. But there was only silence. She checked Melissa's room. She checked the backyard. She called Marcus, who had stayed after school for baseball practice. He hadn't seen his sister. Sarah's worry began to escalate into something sharper, something closer to fear. By 4:30, when Melissa still hadn't appeared and none of her friends had seen her, Sarah called David at work, her voice tight with panic. David left the hardware store immediately and drove home, his mind racing through increasingly frightening possibilities. By 5 o'clock, they had called the police. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with the words, "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story and wants to know how this case was finally solved after more than 2 decades. The Valdosta Police Department responded quickly to the call about a missing 8-year-old girl. In a small town like Valdosta, everyone knew everyone, and the disappearance of a child was treated with the utmost seriousness. Officers immediately began canvassing the neighborhood, knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen Melissa that afternoon. They spoke to her friends, her teachers, neighbors, anyone who might have seen something. What they discovered was both frustrating and terrifying. Multiple witnesses had seen Melissa leaving school that afternoon. She had been alone, walking in the direction of her home, just like she did every day. She had been seen walking along Patterson Street at approximately 3:15. And then, somewhere between the school and her house, a distance of less than half a mile, Melissa Reese simply vanished. There were no witnesses to an abduction. No one saw her get into a car. No one heard screams or sounds of a struggle. She had simply been walking along a familiar route in broad daylight, and then she was gone, as if she had evaporated into the warm spring air. The investigation expanded rapidly. By nightfall, search parties had been organized. Volunteers from all over Valdosta and surrounding areas showed up to help look for Melissa. Neighbors, church members, teachers, strangers who had heard about the missing girl. They combed through the neighborhoods surrounding the school. They searched yards and alleyways and abandoned buildings. They called out Melissa's name over and over, hoping desperately to hear a response. David and Sarah Reese were living every parent's absolute worst nightmare. The not knowing was torture. Was their daughter hurt? Was she scared? Was she calling out for them? The possibilities that ran through their minds were too horrible to fully acknowledge. They clung to hope because the alternative was unthinkable. They told themselves that Melissa would be found, that she had simply gotten lost or confused, that she would come home. As hours turned into days, the search intensified. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation was called in to assist. The FBI eventually became involved, given the possibility that Melissa might have been taken across state lines. Search and rescue teams with trained dogs were brought in to track any scent. Helicopters flew overhead, searching from the air. Divers searched nearby bodies of water, a grim task that everyone hoped would prove unnecessary. The local media covered the story extensively. Melissa's photograph was printed in newspapers across Georgia and beyond. It was shown on television news broadcasts. Flyers with her picture and description were distributed throughout the region. Have you seen this girl? 8 years old, blonde hair, blue eyes, last seen wearing a pink shirt and blue jeans. If you have any information, please contact the Valdosta Police Department immediately. The community rallied around the Reese family in extraordinary ways. Fundraisers were organized to help cover the costs associated with the search efforts and to support the family as they took time off work to focus on finding their daughter. Prayer vigils were held at the Methodist church where the family worshiped. People they had never met brought food to their house, offered to help in any way they could, wept alongside them. Investigators pursued every possible lead, no matter how small or unlikely. They interviewed known sex offenders in the area. They looked into family members and acquaintances, eliminating each person systematically. They chased down reported sightings of Melissa, traveling to different cities and states based on tips that came in, only to have each one lead to disappointment. They investigated the possibility that she had run away, though everything they knew about Melissa made this seem impossible. 8-year-old children, especially ones as close to their families as Melissa had been, don't simply run away without reason. As weeks turned into months, the reality that most people didn't want to voice became harder to ignore. The statistics were grim. The likelihood of finding a missing child alive decreased dramatically with each passing day. Most abducted children are either found within the first few hours or they aren't found alive at all. But there was no body, no evidence of what had happened to Melissa. And so her family held on to hope, even as that hope grew more fragile with each passing day. Sarah Reese became a tireless advocate for her missing daughter. She gave interviews to any media outlet that would listen. She traveled to other cities to distribute flyers. She worked with organizations dedicated to finding missing children. She refused to let Melissa be forgotten, refused to let her daughter become just another statistic. David threw himself into the search with equal determination, taking leave from his job to dedicate every waking hour to finding his little girl. Marcus, who was 11 years old when his sister disappeared, struggled in ways that children often do when trauma invades their lives. He withdrew from his friends. His grades at school suffered. He stopped playing baseball, the sport he had once loved so much. The guilt that he felt for not walking home with his sister that day, even though it wasn't his fault and he had been at practice like he was supposed to be, ate away at him. The entire family was trapped in a nightmare from which they couldn't wake up. As the first anniversary of Melissa's disappearance approached, investigators had to face a difficult reality. Despite their exhaustive efforts, despite following up on hundreds of leads, despite searching thousands of acres of land, despite interviewing countless potential witnesses and suspects, they were no closer to finding Melissa Reese than they had been on the day she vanished. The case was growing cold. The investigation continued, but with fewer resources dedicated to it as time passed. New cases demanded attention. Leads dried up. The massive search efforts were scaled back. The story faded from the front pages of newspapers. Melissa's face appeared less frequently on television news. For the general public, life moved on. But for David and Sarah Reese, for Marcus, for everyone who loved Melissa, time had stopped on April 26, 1989. Years passed with no answers. The Reese family's life became defined by Melissa's absence. They kept her room exactly as it had been the day she disappeared, unable to change anything, as if preserving the space might somehow bring her back. They celebrated her birthday every year, though she wasn't there. They marked the anniversary of her disappearance with renewed pleas for information. They never gave up hope, even when hope seemed irrational, because giving up hope meant accepting that Melissa was gone forever, and they couldn't do that. They wouldn't do that. Investigators kept the case open but classified as cold. Melissa's file sat in the police department, accumulating dust but never forgotten. Detective James Morrison, who had been one of the lead investigators when Melissa first disappeared, never stopped thinking about the case. Even as he worked other investigations, even as years turned into decades, Melissa Reese haunted him. The little girl with the gap-toothed smile who had vanished without a trace. The case he couldn't solve. The family he couldn't give closure. And then, in the spring of 2014, 23 years after Melissa disappeared, something extraordinary happened. Something that would finally crack this seemingly unsolvable cold case wide open and bring answers to a family that had waited for more than 2 decades. The break in the case came from an entirely unexpected source. A woman named Jennifer Anderson walked into a police station in Charleston, South Carolina, wanting to apply for a passport so she could travel abroad for the first time. It should have been a routine procedure. Fill out the application, provide proof of citizenship, submit a birth certificate, pay the fee. But when Jennifer Anderson tried to obtain a copy of her birth certificate as part of the passport application process, she discovered something impossible. Her birth certificate didn't exist. According to official records, Jennifer Anderson, who was 31 years old and had lived her entire life believing she knew exactly who she was, had never been born. Not officially, not legally. There was no record of her birth in the state of Florida, where she had always been told she was born. There was no record of her birth anywhere. It was as if Jennifer Anderson had materialized out of thin air at some point in her childhood. Jennifer was understandably confused and disturbed by this discovery. She contacted the woman she had always known as her mother, a woman named Patricia Anderson, demanding answers. Patricia, who was now in her 60s and in poor health, finally broke down and told Jennifer a truth that shattered everything Jennifer thought she knew about her life. Patricia Anderson was not her biological mother. Jennifer had not been born in Florida. Her real name was not Jennifer Anderson. She had been taken as a child, and Patricia had raised her as her own daughter, creating a false identity for her that had lasted more than 2 decades. Jennifer was devastated, disbelieving, and desperate to understand who she really was. Patricia, perhaps seeking some form of redemption or simply unburdening herself of a secret she had carried for 23 years, provided enough information for authorities to begin investigating. She described taking a little girl from Georgia back in 1989. She couldn't or wouldn't provide specific details about exactly how or why, but she gave enough information that investigators could begin searching for a match. The Charleston Police Department contacted the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, providing the information Patricia had given them. Specialists at the center began comparing the details against their database of unsolved missing children cases from 1989. The pieces fit. An 8-year-old girl abducted from Valdosta, Georgia on April 26, 1989. Blonde hair, blue eyes, a gap-toothed smile in her photographs. DNA testing was quickly arranged. Samples were taken from Jennifer Anderson and compared against DNA that David and Sarah Reese had provided to law enforcement years earlier, hoping that someday it might help identify their daughter. The results came back with scientific certainty. Jennifer Anderson was Melissa Reese. The little girl who had been missing for 23 years had been found alive. The reunion between Melissa and her biological family was emotional beyond description. David and Sarah Reese, who had aged more than 2 decades while waiting for this moment, came face to face with their daughter, now a 31-year-old woman they didn't know. Melissa, who had no memory of them, no memory of her life before she became Jennifer Anderson, struggled to process the reality that her entire existence had been built on a lie. She had been 8 years old when she was taken, young enough that the memories of her early childhood had faded, especially under whatever circumstances had surrounded her abduction and the life she had lived afterward. Patricia Anderson was arrested and charged with kidnapping, child abduction, and related crimes. The investigation into exactly how she had abducted Melissa revealed a disturbing picture. Patricia had been struggling with infertility and mental health issues. She had become obsessed with having a daughter. On that April afternoon in 1989, she had been driving through Valdosta when she spotted Melissa walking home from school alone. In what appeared to be an impulsive act driven by desperation and delusion, Patricia had approached Melissa, told her there was an emergency involving her mother, and convinced the trusting 8-year-old to get in her car. She had driven Melissa to Florida, where Patricia was living at the time, and had simply begun raising her as her own child under a completely fabricated identity. Patricia had created false documents for Melissa, whom she renamed Jennifer. She homeschooled her to avoid the scrutiny that would come with enrolling her in a public school. She moved frequently, never staying in one place long enough for anyone to ask too many questions. She isolated Jennifer from forming close relationships with others. She told Jennifer that her father had abandoned them, that they had no other family, that they needed to stay away from people who might try to hurt them. Patricia had constructed an entire false reality, and Melissa, taken at such a young age and subjected to psychological manipulation, had eventually accepted this reality as truth. The memories of her real family, her real life, had faded into something that felt like distant dreams she couldn't quite grasp. For 23 years, while David and Sarah Reese mourned their missing daughter, while investigators worked a cold case that seemed impossible to solve, while the community of Valdosta remembered the little girl who had vanished, Melissa had been alive. She had grown up, gone through her teenage years, become an adult, all while living under a stolen identity with the woman who had abducted her. The resolution of Melissa Reese's case brought a mixture of joy and heartbreak to everyone involved. Joy that she had been found alive, that she had survived, that she would have the opportunity to reconnect with her biological family. Heartbreak over all the years that had been stolen from them, the childhood and adolescence they had missed, the relationship they would have to rebuild from scratch with a daughter who was now a stranger to them. Marcus Reese, now 34 years old and married with children of his own, was reunited with the sister he had lost when he was 11. The guilt he had carried for 23 years, the irrational belief that he should have somehow protected her, finally had a context. He hadn't failed her. She had been the victim of a crime that no one could have prevented. Detective Morrison, who had never forgotten about Melissa's case, finally got the closure he had worked toward for more than 2 decades. He had been right to keep the case open, right to never give up. Melissa Reese had been found, and her abductor would face justice. If you made it to the end of this incredible story, thank you for watching and for caring about cases like Melissa's that remind us to never give up hope. Please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and turn on notifications so you can follow more amazing true crime cases that need to be told. Share this video with anyone you think would be moved by Melissa's story. Drop a comment below telling me your thoughts on this case. I'll see you in the next video.